Genesis chapter 15 in our Bibles again today. I know we were there last week, but that's where we'll be returning to as we continue on some verses that follow when we study the life of Abraham. And it's really not so much a focus on Abraham and his character, even though there's a lot that can be gleaned from that. It's really more on a focus on who Abraham's God was and how great and mighty he is. And we still serve that same God. We honor him today, hopefully with our lives, and we return to just those roots of understanding in a way of how these early patriarchs did. May we model our lives in that way of faithfulness. And I think Abraham is a great place for us to kind of continue. In Charlotte, North Carolina, back in January of 2000, which is 18 years ago. Some of you, that might not seem so long, but 18 years ago, the citizens there of Charlotte, North Carolina, and city leaders wanted to honor their most famous citizen with a banquet. And that famous citizen that they had was Billy Graham. Great preacher and evangelist. They wanted to honor him. Well, back in 2000, he had kind of developed some Parkinson's that happened, and he denied not really wanting to go because of some of that, but they kind of kept requesting that. And, out of some humility, he didn't want to go either, but eventually he got enough requests for that. They said, well, we don't really want you to have to address or make anything big or anything out of it. We really just want to honor you, and if you just make a couple comments, that's what we'd like to do. And he decided, okay, well, we can do that. And they had a great dinner. It was a great time. And he got up to the podium to make just a couple comments. And he said, it reminds me of a story that I read in Time magazine that was just a month ago, honoring Albert Einstein as the greatest mind and one of the greatest men of our last century. And he told a story about Einstein, and documented that, about him leaving a train from Princeton and making his way. As he got on the train, he sat down with his coat and his briefcase. And just as a train does, as it takes off from the station, the conductor comes and makes his way down the center aisle and taking the tickets of the people. With that, the conductor finally came to Albert Einstein and asked for his ticket. And Einstein reached into his pocket where he was sure he left it, and it was nowhere to be found. With that, the frantic scientist started searching his other pockets and making his way to his briefcase and looking everywhere he could to find his ticket, because he was found with none. The conductor, being a man who kind of knew who he was, decided, hey, it's okay, Dr. Einstein. I know who you are. You're fine. And with that, the conductor made his way through the rest of the cart until he got to the end. And with that, the conductor turned around and sees the old man is down on his hands and knees in the floor of the car looking for his ticket. He comes back quickly to a frantic Einstein and says, "Sir, you don't have to worry about this. I know who you are." And with that, he said, "Dear boy, I know who I am too. I just don't know where I'm going." The story is probably appropriate for us given the text that we have today that we are going to study. Because when God called Abraham out of Ur, he literally left everything he knew to go to a place where he did not know where he was going. And there's a big difference in not knowing where and not knowing if. That's one of the things we'll be discovering as well. He didn't know where he was going, but he was sure where he was going was a specific place, because God had called him to go to this place which be a new land for him. A land where God would give him a place that would be a promise. And one of Abraham's purposes of this faith journey was to claim this land. And he wanted to see God claim the land to become his land claim. Notice that after the lesson last week, we see that Abraham opens with a question from God. Because he's been living in this territory for a while now, and there was this promise that Abraham was continually to follow, that God was going to surely fulfill. And the question that Abraham was, am I going to be a father or not? This is something that I desire. You say that you're going to make a people, a nation out of me, and I don't have a son. So Father, are you going to do that? Are you going to make me a father? And God resolves that within that text. Abraham still has to wait on that, But God resolves that question. And we're going to notice the first thing here that crosses Abraham's mind after that promise is another promise that God gave him, and that we're going to look at in verse 7 of chapter 15 together. And it reads this way. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abraham said, Sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, Bring me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abraham brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each of each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. The birds of prey came down, and they preyed on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. As the sun was setting, Abraham fell into a deep sleep, and a thick, dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, Know for certain that 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country that is not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated. But I will push the nations. I will punish the nation that they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will not go to your ancestors. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and will be buried at a good old age. Verse 16. In the 4 generations, your descendants will come back here, and from the sins of the Amorites that I have not reached their full measure, when the sun had set and the darkness had fallen, a smoking fiery pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. On the day the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, he said, To your descendants I give this land, from Wadi of Egypt to the great river of the Euphrates, and the land of the Kenites, the Kizzites, the Kidmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the... I have trouble with these. I really practice this, I want you to know. So if you have a better version of this, you go right ahead, okay? The Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, there's my favorite one because I really practice that one, and the Jebusites. Now understand here in this text, and I know it kind of gets a little bit choppy there for the end, we have a promise of something that you couldn't wait for it to happen. Have you ever had something like that? Have you ever had something promised to you, but you just couldn't wait? You anticipated it to happen. You couldn't wait for it to get there, for that time to come. I think ladies here in the crowd would probably really understand that. You were promised a ring at some point. And with that promise, you anticipated that time for that ring to be slipped on your finger. Oh yeah? Oh yeah. You waited. You couldn't wait for that time to get there. Now you could probably wait. Now what you know, right? Okay. But nevertheless, you couldn't wait for that moment to come. In the same way, the people who adopt children, they wait for the day. They file lots of paperwork. They put a lot of money out there. And the most gratifying words that they ever read is when that paperwork comes back, that stamp says, you are approved. You cannot wait for the day to take possession of what you've longed for so long. And that's where Abraham is. And in that same way, that's where you and I should be when it comes to waiting on the Lord and the promise of our promised land that comes the idea of heaven. You and I should anticipate that time, be excited about that time, waiting for that fulfillment of the promise to come as God is going to reward us in that way. Here's what Abraham is doing. He is the father of our faith. In a lot of ways, he's our mentor. And we should take our faith seriously and be longing for that land. Because we are made for not only a place, but we are also made for a person. Because Jesus Christ said this. He said, I am going to prepare a place for you. And I am going to come back and I'm going to take you to that place with me so you can be with me forever. Because He made a place for us. But He is also our person. Abraham is our father figure and what this looks like to anticipate that moment for us. Because he wants that promised place for us. He wants us to be in that place. And He wants that promise to ring out in our minds and for us to long for in that way. God reminds Abraham in this text that he wasn't wandering aimlessly from place to place for no reason. That he was not here by accident. In fact, what we see in verse 7 of this chapter 15, he says, I am the Lord who brought you out. He's reminding Abraham of this. I am behind your story. I am behind the plot line here. I brought you with a purpose to give you this land so that you can take possession of it. And Abraham has been in this land for possibly about 10 years at this point. He has walked it, yet he has not owned any of it. And he's waiting. Usually when God talks to Abraham, usually there's an altar being built involved. But this time, it's not that way. This time, this conversation comes as a question. And Abraham asks the question, how can I know I will gain possession of it? Now notice this question is not out of doubt. And you might think of that because as we read that passage, we would often think, well, Abraham is obviously doubting God here. But that is simply not the case. Because if we remember the verses before that we read last week, we remember what it stated. Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness. This statement, this question was not out of unbelief. But as we read the statement, we could probably read it in those ways. And so when we read questions like that in the Bible where we ask the question, well, how can this be? We often look at it as a belief and unbelief. And there are examples of that in the Bible. If you look at Luke chapter 1, there's a story about Zechariah. And Zechariah is the father of John the Baptist, who is one day going to come. And once again, we see the story of some old people who never had kids. And Zechariah is chosen to go into the temple and offer sacrifice on behalf of the people. And he goes in there and something happens that hasn't happened in years. God then speaks to the people through an angel to Zechariah. Zechariah is startled by this, and what happens, and the angel comes and says, Zechariah, you and your wife, you're going to have a son. And he responds this way, how can this be since we're old? That's how he responds. The question was, no way. There's no way. How can this happen? Just a couple verses later, we see that the same angel appears again, but he appears to Mary. And to Mary, he says, you are going to bear a child, even though you are a virgin. And she says, how can this be? Now to us and to our eyes, we kind of view it and we think, well, that's the same thing here. Is she expressing doubt? No. What she was expressing was this, awesome. How's he going to do it? That's how it is. And so when we read that passage, understand where it comes to our faith as well and how we read this and how we might ask or question God. This is what Abraham is doing here. He's simply expressing a great desire to possess what God has promised. And God doesn't respond by rebuking. He doesn't respond that way. But what he does is he gives revelation to Abraham. God says, go get some animals. And Abraham understood what that meant. Back in that time, they would seal covenants by doing things like this and what we read. Back in those days, there are many ways to seal covenant. If you look even in our Bibles ourselves, you will see examples of covenants. We have an example in the book of Ruth where Boaz and the kinsman redeemer exchanged sandals. Well, that's bad if one person's like a size 9 and the other person's a 12. I don't know how you go on about living that way, but I don't know. But that was one example of sealing a covenant. There was another covenant that was called the salt covenant. But one of the ones that was most binding of all when it came to covenants was the blood covenant. And that's the example that we see right here in our passage today. Where you take an animal and you cut it in half, putting each side apart from one another, and then the two parties would walk between the carcass. And that would signify that whatever happened to this animal, surely let that happen to me if I break the covenant or I do not fulfill the terms of the covenant. So Abraham sets the animal apart and God shows up. This is amazing here. God shows up in the form of a smoking pot, a torch. And this is the first time the Bible shows God showing up since we see in the Garden of Eden as he walked with Adam and Eve. And this is a big deal to God. Understand that. Of how God shows up and he makes a covenant with Abraham in this way. God shows up. It is saying, this is very important to me, Abraham. This is important to me about this promise of this place that is not just to you but to your descendants. And Abraham, I know that you're longing for this and I want to make this known to you. A lot of people think that when it's all said and done, that you live on in what you leave behind. Now, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm all about leaving a legacy for your family and leaving a good legacy. I'm all about that. Understand. But if that's all we have to long for, is just giving our kids a good inheritance, is making sure that, which a lot of those things can be good. Understand that. But if that's all we have to leave, if that's our only investment is right here, then really this world is just meaningless if we have limited ourselves to that measure. And the New Testament writer is going to take the story that we have seen today, and he's going to take this and he's going to say, as your spiritual descendants of Abraham, you need to be like Abraham and need to be longing for a promised land. And what I hope our text does today is I hope that God's words to Abraham, not just that were encouragement to him, but are also encouragement to us. Because he says three things that he's also saying to you and I today, and is this. This land is yours, and know that for certain. Understand, God does not predict. What God does here is he decrees. That's what he gives Abraham. Not speculation. He gives proclamation. It's an announcement. And he says this in verse 18. To your descendants, I give this land. Now understand, in the Hebrew word of give here, it is a prophetic perfect tense. And here's what that means. It means God is going to speak of a future. And he's going to speak of that future as if it has already happened. It's very interesting that God does this. In other translations it says, he has given. In other translations it says, this land is yours. It's already a done deal. It has already happened. And yet it has not fulfilled yet. How did God already know it was going to happen? Well, we need to remember that God lives in an ever-present. And lives in an ever-present tense. God is outside of our limitations of time. And God can look at whatever he's going to the future, and he can announce that at any time he wants. Why? Because he has already decided. Here's an example of this as we look at chapter 21 of Joshua, and it records the different tribes and the parts of the land that they possess. And here's what it picks up in verse 43. It says, and so the Lord gave Israel all the land that he had sworn to give to their ancestors. And they took possession of it and settled there. And the Lord gave them the rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. See, God's promises are dependable. And here's why. Because they depend on him. And that's the second thing we can see about Abraham and what God said to Abraham. The guarantee is mine. Two things would have stood out in this ceremony if you and I lived in the culture of that day, if you and I were there. And the two things that would stood out about this covenant that happens between Abraham and God are this. The first one is there's a large number of animals that are selected for this. God tells him what to go get. And Abraham shows up with all of those animals and hacks them in two. Typically, when it came to a blood sacrifice and when this happened, or a blood covenant, it usually happened just with one animal. It was just one. But I think what God is doing here, he's making a point. I want to call attention to this. This land thing is important to me. It's personal to me. I am showing up here. And the second thing I think you and I would notice if we lived in that culture and in that time is that it only involved one party. Remember, when this blood covenant thing happened between parties, both of the parties would walk in between. But here's what God does. He doesn't invite Abraham to walk in between. He only does it himself. Abraham promised nothing. Only God went through the pieces. Everyone knew the custom was between two parties, and together it was a commitment. But God does not invite Abraham because it depends only on God. Some scholars say, as it said, some of those birds of prey, as they came down and tried to eat some of the carcasses that Abraham went and shoot them off, were really just prophetic means of saying that there are different nations that are going to try to come in, that are going to try to keep Israel from fulfilling its destiny, and God has ordained her, and therefore it will not fail. And the guarantee is God's. It is good. God's word is good. And here's the deal. It's still good news for you and for me. Because the author picks up the story in Hebrews chapter 6, starting in verse 13 as we read. It says this: when God made his promise to Abraham, since there was no one greater for him to swear by, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and give you many descendants. And so after waiting patiently, Abraham received what was promised. People swear by someone greater than themselves, and the oath confirms what is said and puts an end to all arguments. Because God wanted to make an unchanging nature of his purpose very clear to the heirs of what he had promised, he confirmed it with an oath. God did this so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of this hope set before us may greatly be encouraged. Here's what the Hebrew author is saying. You should be encouraged by what God did for Abraham. God guaranteed to Abraham, swearing by himself, that he will keep every promise, and therefore you and I should have a great hope when it comes to this idea of heaven. When it comes to this idea of what is to come, that fulfillment, that glory land, when it comes to that, you and I should have that same type of confidence and commitment as what Abraham did. Much later, Jesus will be with his disciples and will be eating dinner with them. And this is recorded in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all mention it. And Jesus says this in all three Gospels: this is my blood covenant. Jesus echoes back to the promise that was made with Abraham. This is my blood covenant. And Luke says, this is the blood of the new covenant. The covenant only depends on the work of God, nothing to do with us. And the new covenant is arranged between you and Jesus Christ, and Jesus is going to be that sacrifice. And just like Abraham, we have a role, yes, but we have an only role in us trusting that covenant that Jesus fulfilled, especially when it seems unlikely. And here's the third thing he says: the possession is going to be delayed. I hear people say like this: it's like waiting on heaven for them to show up. and that's what it can be like. We don't like waiting. My generation likes instant gratification. I like it to just show up for me. I like it to be done. And God's saying this: hey, expect delays. Expect delays. It says 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. Now, I want you to take a moment as God reveals this to Abraham of something that's going to happen in the future, and put yourself in Abraham's shoes. Up to this point, every time God has spoke to Abraham, it's been about a blessing. It's been about blessing and focusing on that, how he's going to bless his people. And now God shows up and he says, oh, by the way, I want you to know this. There's going to be about 400 years of slavery, and I'm just going to bring that up for you, just so you know. God reveals more about his grand story, and he includes some of the chapters that Abraham would prefer not to read or maybe not to know about. God, I just wish that wasn't there. And he includes one chapter which is called Waiting on the Amorites. God says, Abraham, I cannot let you have this land yet. And there's reason for that. There's reason for that. I cannot judge the Amorites yet. It's going to be another 400 years. And I'm going to let their sin meet its full measure. Now to us, I want to explain this a little bit because this echoes to you and I's hearts as well. Into the people of this world. We think, wow, how can this evil happen in this world? Why does God allow this to happen? Why isn't he stepping in here? But I want you to understand the fullness and amazing grace of God. When it comes to our world, but also when it came to the Canaanites, he guaranteed another 4 centuries. Another centuries worth of full depravity that would come and be expressed by their hearts. But through that, it negated all the questions regarding, is God really righteous when it comes to dealing with these people? Because they became solely deprived that everybody knew judgment needs to happen. These people don't deserve to live in this land anymore. God's delays always have a purpose, and they still do. We don't like delays. But understand, they very well could serve great purpose in our lives. 2 Peter addresses who he writes to, and he addresses them, and they have a whole bunch of questions about, well, we're talking about heaven a lot. We talk about the second coming, and where is that leading us to? How come he hasn't shown up? Everything seems like it's ready to go. Why doesn't God show up? Why doesn't God fulfill these things? You say God is coming. Why is it taking so long? And that's a good question, because you and I probably ask that question ourselves. Why is this process taking so long? Why is God delayed? And for that same reason, he did also in Genesis chapter 15. But let's see what 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 8 has to say. It reads this way. But do not forget this one thing, my dear friends. With the Lord, the day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. Verse 9, and the Lord will not slow in keeping his promises, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. I like that last part so much. Maybe one of the reasons that God has delay was opportunity for people to come to know him. It might not so much be for you and I, even though maybe there's an opportunity for us to come to repentance. That's what it's talking about here. But for others to recognize they need the saving grace of Jesus Christ. That's why. He waits for that full measure of sin to be reached. And he will judge the land. And the world will come so deprived and reach the point where there is no question of God's righteousness when it comes to his judgment against him. Let's continue on in verse 10 of that same passage. It says, but the day of the Lord comes like a thief in the night. The heavens will disappear with a roar, and the elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? You ought to live holy and godly lives as you look forward to the day of God and to his speedy coming. This day will bring about the destruction of heaven by fire, and the elements will melt in the heat. But in keeping with his promise, we will be looking forward to the new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. God said to Abraham, I've got some good news for you, but I got some bad news. The good news is, Abraham, you're going to live to be an old man. And you're going to die peacefully. And you're never going to be enslaved or never be in a foreign or a strange country. But here's the bad news. You are never going to personally realize the promise claiming of the land yourself physically. The Bible tells us that Abraham is our example. And like Abraham, we have been called to live lives as pilgrims, waiting for the rightful place to come. We think the question often is in our life, when are we going to get to that land? When is this going to happen? Or as your kids might say, are we there yet? But God says, hey, that's not what the question is. Here's the question. The question is, what kind of people are you going to be until that day comes? What are you going to act like? And I want to close with a simple thought. By staking my claim, it means to choose to live life in a future tense and with a future reality. I think that's what Abraham did. I think that is why he is such an example for us in the New Testament. He never asked God again about this land thing. He never asked that again, even though he is not going to see it through himself. He spends the rest of his life fully embracing the future reality in a present encouragement And the Bible says his story is our story, and this is an example of inspiration for us. That's why we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 in this way. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go to a place where he would later receive his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in a promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as so did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of that same promise. For he was looking forward to a city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God. We live in a future tense, and we are able to embrace the things of our life. Abraham was able to embrace his old age. He was able to embrace his death, which was going to come. And he was able to embrace those things peacefully and also confidently because of the land claim. The Bible asks the question, is that how you are waiting? The Bible asks that question, are you waiting like the model, your father, Abraham? Let me be honest. I don't like waiting that way. Do you? I have a hard enough time watching paint cure before I put a second coat on, and I often put a run in it. Don't you? I have a hard enough time with that. And I could probably wait like Abraham if I know the promise was going to come next week. I could probably wait like Abraham if I knew it was coming that close. I could live in a future tense if I knew it was coming next week. But I don't. And here's what we know. While we wait, you and I are probably going to have to endure some chapters in our life that we would rather not read. You and I are probably going to have to endure some pain, some disease, some mistreatment, and those are things that we'd rather not go through. Father, won't you just come quickly? Can we just avoid all that? Could you just step in here? Could you just intervene? The temptation is for us to settle and to get comfortable in this land because we're tired of waiting for that next chapter. But the Bible says, look at Abraham, and then look at Jesus, and fix your eyes on the covenant that he has made with you and me, and stake your claim and wait for the next to come. Back to what we heard in the beginning about Billy Graham. After he got done telling the story about Albert Einstein not knowing where his ticket was and not knowing where he was going, he said, you see this new suit I'm wearing? I bought this just for this occasion. I'm only going to wear this suit one other time. First occasion is right here in front of all you folks, and then I'll wear it again when I'm buried in it. And when you see me in the casket, don't remember the suit, but remember that I know who I am, and I know where I am going. We're supposed to long for a land. And sometimes we have gotten comfortable just right where we are. All of us wish we didn't have some chapters in our lives that we had to read. But we need to long for a land. And what we need to do is we need to claim that promise. Have you claimed that promise in your life? Maybe it's an opportunity to. There's an invitation that is offered by Jesus Christ. And he offers you to come be a part of the family. And with that, there comes an inheritance. And that land claim, that's part of it. It's part of our job to wait for that to come.